there's a fraud that is affecting a lot of temporary workers, throughout the UK. By temporary workers, I mean anyone who works for an employment agency, and they're often asked to join an umbrella company, a payroll company. Now, in 2006, the Labour government introduced these micro entities, which are very small limited companies, and these companies would eventually be given new regulations under the Tory government in 2013, whereby they weren't they didn't have to comply with the regulations for auditing like larger companies do, a normal small business would. And one of those exemptions was that they didn't have to produce detailed accounts, that it could be the minimum amount of information to present to HMRC and to Companies House every year as part of your submitted accounts. So you didn't have to give such a detailed breakdown. In 2014, the Tory government introduced what is still called Employment Allowance. That Employment Allowance started off with a £2,000 tax relief, if you will, on national insurance contributions that were paid by the employer, not by the employee, the employer's national insurance contribution. Since 2014, that allowance has increased to £5,000 a year. So basically, a small business can be more encouraged. So it was sold to small businesses to say, you'll pay less contributions. It will help you to grow your business because you won't be paying as much in national insurance contributions. Which sounds great, you know. If you've just got one employee, for example, and that employee is paid, say, a 22 grand a year salary, normally you would pay £1,000, just over a grand worth of employer's NI every year, and because it falls within the £5,000 threshold, you wouldn't pay anything. You don't pay any employer's national insurance contributions for that employee. So on paper it sounds good, but unfortunately this scheme has been abused on a mass scale. It has made the headlines, but I don't think it's really something that I see the left or the unions really hammering home about. Recently, in 2021, G-Force, the security services company, was exposed for using what are called mini umbrella company schemes. And what these are supposedly umbrella companies. So there are two different types of umbrella. The ones that I call legitimate but still sort of hanging around on the threshold of what's legal, and the ones that utilise mini umbrellas. Now, the legitimate ones, let's say for example I get a job in a factory, a warehouse or a construction site, and let's call the umbrella company Dave's Payroll or something. Yeah, I do know names of companies, but I want to leave them out because of GDPR and what have you. I don't want to get into trouble. I want this video to stay up. So Dave's Payroll sets you on. You are recruited to work at the place that you work at by Nigel's agency, whatever. But you don't work for them, you don't work for the agency, and you don't work for the people that you're apparently in the building working for, you know. So let's say Pete's garage or whatever, you're working there as a mechanic, and Nigel sent you there, but you're not employed by either of them. Neither of them pays you. It's Dave's payroll that pays you. Now, if Dave's payroll is an umbrella company, you'll see on your pay slip that there is an employer's national insurance contribution being paid, but it's not Dave's payroll, it's you that pays it. So that gets deducted from your gross, and then whatever's left after that, you then pay your normal employees tax and NI. Okay, now that, believe it or not, is a legitimate umbrella company. The illegitimate ones that use mini umbrella companies, you won't even see that employer's NI, and the reason being is because they're not paying it. You'll see your tax and NI, but you won't see any deduction on their end. It's not coming out of your gross, which is good, but there's a greater consequence here that there's a large amount of companies that are using this scheme. So at the moment, the most recent statistics for it is about 1.1 million thereabouts of small companies, and given the high, very, very high potential of abuse, I think that you could probably say that at least half of those companies are abusing the scheme. So, you know, if they're all claiming back £5,000 worth of employers' NI, then you can see how this fraud is impacting the state's ability to fund services, and the major impact that it will cause, you know, in the multiples of billions, has probably been evaded. You know, it might not be that far-fetched to say that maybe £100 billion in total since the scheme began, you know, has been avoided being paid, which, you know, brings up other questions about the cost of living, and, you know, that money could probably be coming from these employers. Now, the way that these mini umbrellas work is that, let's go back to Dave's payroll. Dave all of a sudden finds this dodgy accountant, and this accountant says, right, what I've got is loads of these little companies that have been fronted, they've been set up by people in this country. The people in this country are people who were found on Facebook. I think there was one company called Starline Limited that was exposed by the BBC. And basically they would pay anybody £150 just to set up a company, and they would then immediately resign. These companies would then be registered at a virtual address in the UK, and the director would then be somebody from the Philippines. And if you just go on Companies House and do the Simply search, you'll see that there's thousands of these companies that you could find within minutes. Okay. And all of these companies are used by Dave's payroll, then uses this intermediary who's usually offshore, and they take all of the employees that are working through Dave's payroll, and they put one in each of these companies. So it's like a hydra of mini shell companies, and each company has one employee, and they basically keep them within the threshold So usually, I think they'll, from what I saw by monitoring a couple of them, they'll probably let you earn about 15 grand a year. So you're well within the bracket of that 5 grand a year in a way that it doesn't look too suspicious. Immediately, as soon as you hit whatever arbitrary threshold they deem as unsuspicious, you then get a new employer. So you'll immediately, without your knowledge, without being told, well, you will find out eventually, because it'll show up through whatever portal that you've got a new contract of employment, your new employer is blah blah blah, and they've usually got really strange names, really random looking names. So once you've hit the threshold, you're immediately re-employed. You're still working at the same place, but you could probably work at that same place for about a year and a half and have about 3 or 4 different employers. But nothing's changed. You just get a notification and an email saying your employer is now blah, blah, blah. And you're like, why? Well, the reason why is so that, it doesn't look too suspicious. Not long after each one of these companies is used, say about a year after, the company gets dissolved and it's not used again. So, basically all of these companies are abusing that scheme. It's affecting, the ability, like state funding. It's so widespread. I mean, the majority of temporary workers just aren't even aware that that's what's happening. It seems to be which agencies don't do it is the question. And then you have to ask, well, what is the government doing about it? But when you look at the history of it, that the Tories have made it very easy for these companies to operate, that they don't have to submit detailed accounts. They can register with virtual addresses, and the directors aren't even in this country. If tighter restrictions were just put on those 3 things, that one, you can't just open up a company and then resign from it 2 days later. That should be just ABC. You should have to stay with the company. You should have to be the director if you're the opening director for a few years before you can resign. But definitely not within 2 or 3 days. And then another restriction should just be, well, if you're running a business that's in the UK, then you should be residing here. You should be paying, you should be here. And then, just companies shouldn't be allowed to use a virtual address. Or if that's not possible, then, company's house could be re-engineered where, addresses aren't shown, but you can't use a virtual address with the authorities, Those 3 things would just eliminate this fraud overnight. They're very tiny things to do. But the curious thing about micro entities is that I was watching a podcast. If I can find it, I'll post it in the description at some point. And it was with some accountants and lawyers, and they were talking to some clients of theirs about micro-entity legislation and the fact that you don't have to submit detailed accounts. And every single one of those clients said that actually it's not really something that they really would want to use. They prefer the more detailed accounts. They like to know exactly where they are to break down what the flow and the revenue is, and to understand the margins properly and to be fully compliant. They actually like the detail. So if it's not really aimed at the small business owner, then who's it aimed at? And I think you can just read between the lines that this is legislation that has been implemented by people who want to make a lot of money and not pay any tax in this country, and to reduce their liabilities in this country. And it's causing mayhem. There's a massive hole, a black hole of contributions that aren't being paid. Now, I'm not saying that all businesses that use employment allowance are illegitimate. You know, I'm sure that there are small businesses, but there's such a large potential of abuse for micro entities using employment allowance that, and given what I've seen with my own eyes, and you know what's visible publicly on Companies House, you know, would tell you otherwise, that there's a massive abuse of that scheme. They can also abuse the VAT flat rate scheme, but that's not something that's affecting the worker as such, because the other fallout for the worker is that you lose a lot of your rights and benefits through these companies. You know, you're completely dispensable. You've got no protections, and yeah, it needs to be dealt with. And I just don't think people are. It is being talked about, but not enough, and definitely not by the left and the unions, and definitely not on the right. And it's just part of this overall agenda of just undermining the state to reduce it to its minimum functions, which only benefits those who are wealthy and really makes things difficult for the low income earners. And it's definitely going to impact the NHS, because the whole point of the employer's national insurance contribution is that because you're employing people, and when people are at work, when they work, they get work-related injuries, the employer must pay some contribution to the National Health Service as a future payment to say, well, you know, eventually people are going to have musculoskeletal injuries and health conditions, hand-arm vibration syndrome, silicosis, you name it, an endless array of work-related ill health and injury, short-term and long-term. That's what that employer's national insurance contribution is for, you know. And if it's not being paid, then it's going to squeeze those services that are there for the worker when they can't work and they can't pay for health care, you know. And this, more and more we're seeing, you know, people who've worked their whole life, you know, members of my family are being forced to pay for services that would otherwise have been available free to them because they paid their national insurance contributions their entire life. But now they're having to fork out thousands just for pain relief, you know, and it's wrong. And then when you see a black hole that is of the government's own making, you have to ask, you know, whose side are they on? You know, you don't need wild conspiracy theories to understand that they're taking a piss, you know. You can just use the facts that are in front of you.